Hey students, this video is going to go over a couple more terms that you need to make sure that you know for this unit. So far we've covered sonnets, meter, and rhythm. Make sure that you understand what each of those terms mean, as well as the underlying terms such as feet. And specifically make sure that you understand iambic pentameter because that is the one that we've been working with most closely. Also, please make sure you understand all of these terms: pun, dramatic irony, imagery, oxymoron, alliteration, assonance, consonance, hyperbole, allusion, extended metaphor, metaphor, simile, personification, and symbolism. All of these terms are ones that we have gone over in previous units, but each and every one of these are used in Hamlet for very significant purposes, and therefore you need to make sure to know them so that you don't miss them while reading the play. Also, please make sure that you can recall the meaning and purpose of all of these devices off the top of your head. At this point, you should have them memorized. So if you don't, please go back and review the ones that you're not quite sure of. So, to start on some of our new material, we've been looking a great deal at poetry in this unit. We've already read a couple poems, and we're going to be reading a ton more. So let's make sure that we understand what to call these poems. So the two major overhead terms that we need to know for poetry in this unit are lyric and narrative. Lyrical poetry are poems that are song-like in nature. So when you read them out loud or to yourself, they sound like songs. They oftentimes have to do with very deeply felt emotions. And the types of poems that fit under this overhead category are elegies, odes, sonnets, and villanelles. All four of these are types of lyrical poems. Additionally, we have narrative poems, which, in contrast, are just like what they sound. They are poems that tell stories. And narrative poems include ballads, dramatic monologues, epics, and satires. So far, we've read an epic for Beowulf. We just read a dramatic monologue with the river merchant's wife's letter. And also, we have read a sonnet with Sonnet 130. We will be dealing with all of these, though, before the unit is over. So let's move on to another important term, which is monologue. So with the monologue, in its most basic definition, it is a speech given by a single person to an audience. Excellent. But let's get a more in-depth look on what a monologue actually is. So for starters, it's a combination of drama and poetry. When you are reading Hamlet and you get to a monologue, it's going to use a ton of rhythm and meter, and it's going to sound like poetry, but it's also still part of the play and how the play's plot is unfolding, how the themes are building, and how the characters are being furthered. So it's serving purposes in both of these departments. Next, it presents the speech of a single character in a specific situation at a critical moment. That's why we're focusing in so closely on monologues and soliloquies, because they mark some of the most important moments of the play when very important things are being revealed and discovered. Next, the speaker addresses one or more persons who are present and who are listening to the speaker, but they remain silent. So we will go into this more closely when we discuss the difference between a monologue or soliloquy. So hold on to this, we'll get back to it. Next, the speaker's personality and character, his relationship to others, his sense of values and attitudes towards life are indirectly gleaned from his monologue. Again, this is why we're focusing in on monologues and soliloquies, because they mark critical moments. And logically, these critical moments are going to reveal very important things about what has been listed here. So let's look more in depth into the third point. The difference between a monologue and a soliloquy are very important to understand. So a monologue is a literary device used in drama, which is characterized by a long speech is the imperative word, delivered or presented by an individual character. What this means is that the character is speaking, people are listening, but they don't actually talk back to the character. They're just there, but they're in on the information that the character has said out loud. Now, in contrast, let's look at a soliloquy. A soliloquy is presented by a single character to himself or herself as an expression of his or her inner thoughts to himself or herself. So a soliloquy is different simply in the fact that other characters aren't present, but it also goes a little further than that. A soliloquy is supposed to be private. The character doesn't want other people to know the information, and therefore it's just between the character and the audience. This oftentimes is points when dramatic irony can be created because the character has shared something with us, the audience, and no one else, and therefore we know a piece of information that other characters don't know. And that is essentially the first step towards developing dramatic irony. So there's a clear link between soliloquy and dramatic irony that monologues don't have. So next, let's move to our next term, which is conceit. This is one that we saw on Friday's AP multiple choice quiz that I told you we would learn more about in this video. So we saw conceit in Sonnet 130, which starts out, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" So before we continue talking about conceit more, let's talk about metaphor. So one thing we discussed in class is, what do test questions mean when they ask if something is a metaphor or metaphorical? Essentially what the question is asking is it comparative? When they use the word metaphor, they're simply asking if something is comparative in nature. Are two or more things being compared to create a clearer message for the reader? Therefore, there are many different literary devices that are housed underneath the overarching term of metaphor. These include allusions, allegories, epithets, extended metaphor, implied metaphor, good old-fashioned metaphor, conceit, personification, and simile. All of these are metaphorical in nature because they are comparative in nature. Therefore, every simile is metaphorical, but not every metaphor is a simile. Now, let's focus on conceit, because that's the one we are interested in for Hamlet and our sonnets. So, a conceit is a complex metaphor which seeks to compare a person or object to something outside the norm. Now, what does that mean? So let's take it a little deeper. A far-fetched simile or metaphor, a literary conceit, occurs when the speaker compares two highly dissimilar things, such as in John Donne's A Valediction Forbidding Morning. And in his poem, Donne compares two souls in love to points on a compass. So usually, a good old-fashioned metaphor, the purpose is to compare two things to create a clearer image, such as comparing two souls in love to doves. That makes sense. That's a normal, good old-fashioned metaphor that helps us better understand what these lovers may be like. Now, when Donne compares two souls in love to 2 points on a compass, the reader might go, "What? I don't get it." And that's essentially the difference between a conceit and a metaphor. A conceit doesn't necessarily make the meaning clear at the very start. Instead, what it does is it asks the speaker to think more deeply about the metaphor so that they can get a more thorough understanding about the complexity of what the author is writing about. So the conceit in this comparison shows a complexity of the two souls in love that a simple metaphor would not create. Let's look at a second example. So here, in Richard II, Shakespeare compares two kings competing for power to two buckets in a well. This is a very uncommon metaphor. We usually compare kings to, oh, say, lions. That's a good old-fashioned metaphor. But comparing two kings to buckets, that's unexpected and somewhat confusing. These things seem to have nothing in common. But what it does is it creates a more complex understanding about the king's behaviors and what the author thinks about what these kings are doing in their competition for power. So that is how a conceit operates. Please make sure not to confuse a conceit with an analogy. While both are more complex forms of metaphors, remember that an analogy compares two things on multiple levels, such as comparing a society to a beehive, where the queen bee and the worker bees and the hive itself represents different aspects in the society. So it's a comparison on multiple levels. A conceit is still like a metaphor in that it's comparing something on one level. It's just the idea that it's provoking deeper thought because it's a very unlikely metaphor. All right, so really quickly, I do want to talk about the Petrarchan ideal love because that relates to Sonnet 130, which is where we first saw conceit used. So seems like a good time to talk about it. So the Petrarchan ideal love is this idea that a woman who an individual is in love with is beautiful and flawless, usually blonde hair, blue eyes, graceful, delicate, a goddess, pretty much perfect. And so that's the Petrarchan ideal love. And so, for instance, in Romeo and Juliet, we see a great deal of this, where Romeo might say, "There is no other woman as beautiful than Rosalind. The all-seeing sun never saw her match since first the world begun." So Rosalind is out of Romeo's reach. In fact, even Cupid's powers are powerless in her, and she does not return his love. So, with this example, we see that Romeo is perceiving his love as essentially perfect. But in Sonnet 130, Shakespeare is making fun of this idea, saying that no woman can actually be like this. So it's kind of interesting in the fact that in Sonnet 130, Shakespeare is making fun of some of his previous works. But I guess it's pretty good to be able to make fun of yourself. So for our last term, let's talk about foils. So a foil is a character who is compared and contrasted with the protagonist. And there are so many great foils that we can think of, including Ron and Harry, Spock and Kirk, Shrek and Donkey, even in The Simpsons, Bart and Lisa. So it is important to know that a foil is a character who provides a striking contrast to another character. By using a foil, a writer calls attention to certain traits possessed by a main character or simply enhances a character by contrast. So in Hamlet, who do you think is the foil to Hamlet? Think about it. Think about it. Think about it. Well, if you haven't figured it out by now, the foil to Hamlet is Laertes. So when you're reading up their characters, take a moment to see just how different they are, because they essentially are opposites in the way that they interact with characters, the way that they see the world, and essentially how they experience their lives. And by having Hamlet and Laertes in the same play, it emphasizes both of their characteristics so that they stand out more starkly to readers, and this foil will be used to further develop the plot and the themes of the play. So that is all for this video. Make sure that you understand what the term foil means, Petrarchan ideal love, conceit, monologues and soliloquies, and then the different types of poems that we're going to cover. If you're able to do that, then you are good. All right, best of luck. Make sure to get notes on these. Bye.